Starving, trembling, two little girls slipped behind the saloon at dawn to steal scraps, and neither child knew the rancher watching would follow them and change his life forever. Because what waited in those hills wasn't a den of thieves. It was their mother, gaunt and fierce and hiding from a town that wanted her gone. And before the year was out, she would be his wife. Coyote Wells, Arizona Territory, the autumn of 1881. This is the story of Winona, a Chiricahua Apache woman, who had buried her husband on a ridge with no name and would have died 100 times over rather than let anyone touch her daughters. And Jesse Cade, a rancher who had no business falling in love with a woman half the territory wanted gone. Stay until the end, because what happens between them by first snow will tell you exactly why this story has stayed with people long after they watched it. If it's doing that for you too, tap like and subscribe before we go on. It helps more than you'd think. Now let's go back to the beginning. The girls came at the same hour every morning, which was itself a kind of miracle since nothing else in their lives ran on a clock. Jesse Cade had noticed them 3 days running before he let himself believe what he was seeing. He'd be up before light doing the thing ranchers did instead of sleeping, checking the water trough, counting horses that hadn't gone anywhere in the night, generally making sure the world hadn't ended while he wasn't looking. And there they'd be, small shapes coming down off the rocks behind Ruiz's saloon like they were made of the same gray stone. Coyote Wells at that hour belonged to almost no one. The blacksmith wouldn't stir his forge for another hour yet. The mercantile stood dark and shuttered, and the only sound in the whole street was the wind combing through the cottonwoods along the dry wash that gave the town its name, and the occasional groan of a drunk sleeping it off in the livery hay. It was a hard little town, built on cattle money and mining money and the particular grudges that grow up wherever those two kinds of money compete for the same dirt. And it had never once, in Jesse's memory, gone out of its way to be kind to anyone who didn't already belong to it. That was exactly why the sight of the twins unsettled him as much as it did. Nothing in Coyote Wells fed. Strays out of charity, which meant whatever kept those girls coming back morning after morning. It was hunger plain and simple, hunger with nowhere better to turn. They moved like they'd done it 1,000 times. One would go low along the wall, quick, checking the alley both ways before she waved the other one down. They'd go through what the last drinkers had left, bread crusts, a rind of bacon fat, once a whole potato, somebody's dog hadn't gotten to first, and they'd eat standing up fast, the way you eat when you don't trust that you'll get to finish. Then they'd go back up into the rocks, gone like they'd never been there at all, and Coyote Wells would wake up around them without ever knowing. It wasn't his business, Jesse figured. He had 400 head of cattle, a bad leg from a rope that had gone wrong 2 summers back, and a ranch that ate every hour God gave him. He did not need to be following children into the hills like some kind of half-wit tracker. But he watched them a 4th morning and a 5th, and by the 6th, he'd noticed the smaller of the two. They looked enough alike to be twins, and he later learned they had a cough that didn't sound like it belonged in a child that size, and something in him. His hired hand, a leathery old-timer named Purdy, who'd worked the Cade spread since before Jesse was old enough to sit a horse, caught him watching the ridge one morning with his coffee going cold in his hand. "You're going to follow him, aren't you?" Not a question, the way Purdy put it, more a verdict already reached. "Somebody ought to know where they're getting to." Purdy spat, not unkindly. "Somebody ought to mind his own herd is what somebody ought to do. Those'll be Apache young'uns, Jesse. You go poking around up in those rocks. You're liable to find grown Apache who don't take kindly to a white man on their trail. Or you find nothing but a den of thieves living off the town's scraps. And then what have you got? A mess. Either way, a mess." Jesse didn't argue the point out loud, though privately he thought Purdy had never in his life watched a child eat the way those two ate. Quick, silent, glancing over their shoulders between bites like the food itself might be taken back. He watched the girls disappear into the rocks that morning, counted to 200 so they wouldn't hear him behind them, and went. The trail wasn't much of a trail at all, more a suggestion of where feet had gone before, half erased by wind, doubling back twice in ways that Jesse understood once he thought about it, were meant to throw off exactly the kind of man he was being right now. Whoever had taught those girls to walk a hillside had taught them well. They crossed rock shelves instead of dirt where they could, and where they couldn't, they stepped in each other's prints like a single set of feet had passed, instead of two. He followed anyway, keeping to the low ground, moving the way his father had taught him to move when he didn't want a deer to know he was in the county, slow through the open stretches, quick through the brush where the sound of his own boots would be swallowed by the wind working the junipers. 20 minutes into the hills, the land folded down into a narrow wash lined with juniper and prickly pear, a place you could walk past 100 times from the mesa above and never guess it held anything at all. The rock here ran red gold where the morning sun caught it, streaked black in the seams where water had once cut through, and the wash itself curled out of sight around a shoulder of stone thick with brush, the kind of country a man could hide a horse in, let alone a camp, if he knew the land the way its oldest people knew it. That was where he saw the smoke. Not much of it, a thread, gray-blue, rising off what looked like nothing more than a hollow in the rock, banked low so it wouldn't carry far or catch a stranger's eye from any distance. Whoever built that fire knew how to hide a fire. Jesse crouched behind a boulder the size of a wagon bed and watched the two girls scramble down into the wash and vanish behind a stand of brush that now, he looked close, had been dragged there and propped against the rock rather than growing out of it. He should have turned around then. He knew it even as he was creeping closer, knew Purdy was right, knew that whatever was tucked back in that hollow was none of his business and would stay none of his business if he had the sense God gave a fence post. He kept going anyway, low, quiet, until he could see past the brush screen into the hollow itself. A woman knelt beside the low fire, and Jesse Cade forgot, for one long moment, every reason he'd had for coming. She was gaunt in a way that came of weeks and not days, cheekbones sharp under skin, gone the color of dust, wrists that looked like they'd snap under any real weight. Her hair was black and long, roughly braided, and her dress, deerskin once fine enough to have been someone's wedding clothes, hung loose on a frame that had clearly once carried more than it did now. And still Jesse would think about this for the rest of his life. The asterisk and still asterisk. Of it she was strikingly beautiful, in the way of something built to endure long past which should have broken him. Her eyes, when the smaller girl ran to her, and she looked up sharp and sudden toward the brush where Jesse crouched, were black and clear and entirely unafraid. Someone is there. Not to the girl, loud enough to carry, in English worn smooth by use, though threaded through with something older underneath it. Come out where I can see you, or go, but do not crouch in my rocks, like you have something to hide. Jesse stood up slow, hands out from his sides, feeling more foolish than he had in a decade. Ma'am, I don't mean any harm. I saw your girls in town and I got curious is all. Followed further than I ought to have. You followed my daughters. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it went very still and very sharp, like a knife laid flat before it turns. She rose in one motion, putting herself between Jesse and the twins without seeming to hurry at all, and he understood in that instant that whatever else this woman was, short on food, strength, the plain luxury of rest, she was not short on will. 20 steps and no closer. You have seen what you came to see. Now you may go and tell the town whatever you like. I'm not fixing to tell the town anything. They will ask why a Cade was seen walking these hills instead of counting his cattle. She knew his name before he'd given it, which unsettled him more than anything else about the morning. A small proof that she had been watching the town every bit as closely as it had failed to watch her. Word travels faster than a man rides in this territory. I've lived that lesson already. I do not intend to teach it to my daughters twice. Wasn't planning on teaching anybody anything, just wanted to know they weren't in trouble. They are in trouble every day of their lives, Mr. Cade. That is not news you needed to climb a mountain to learn." She did not soften, but something behind her eyes measured him a beat longer than the words alone required, the way a person weighs whether a stranger's foolishness comes from cruelty or simple ignorance. "You are the rancher, the one with the big spread west of town, and no wife to run it with you. My daughters have seen you at the corral fence some mornings. They thought you were only a man who could not sleep. Most mornings that's about right." He held his ground at the 20 steps, taking in what the fire lit for him. One blanket, worn through at the corner, a single pot, no rifle that he could see, no horse, no sign of any man about the place at all. Whatever this woman had, it wasn't much, and whatever had brought her to hiding in a wash a half-hour's walk from a town that fed its scraps to drunks before it fed them to children, it wasn't a story with an easy telling. You got a name. Gentler than he meant to ask it, she considered him a long moment, weighing. He'd learn later, not whether to trust him, but how much a name cost her to give away for free. Winona. A pause, and then flatter. "And you have your answer, and you have seen we are not starving for lack of trying. Now go home, Mr. Cade, before someone in town notices you're gone and comes looking." He went. But he did not stop thinking about her, not that day, not the next, and by the third morning he was back at the corral fence before light, watching for two small shapes coming down off the rocks, already turning over in his mind the particular kind of trouble he was about to invite into his life. What Jesse didn't know yet, what it would take him weeks to piece together. Mostly from things Winona let slip sideways, rather than laid out plain, was that she hadn't always been alone in that wash. She was Chiricahua, born in the Dragoon Mountains country. Her mother's people had moved through for longer than any treaty had existed to break, and until 2 years back she had not been alone at all. Her husband had been a quiet, capable man known at the agency only by a clipped mispronunciation of his real name, a tracker good enough that even soldiers had once paid him for it, and a father who could make both his daughters laugh just by pretending not to see them hiding behind his legs. They had lived that year with a small band camped along a creek the maps did not bother to name, gathering mescal and drying meat for winter the way her grandmother had taught her mother and her mother had taught her, in a rhythm that felt, for a while, like it might hold. It did not hold. An army patrol out of Fort Bowie chasing word of raiders who had struck a ranch 2 days south came on the camp at first light and did not wait to learn that the people gathered there had raided nothing and no one. Her husband had died getting his daughters clear of the gunfire, shielding Doli with his own body while he shoved a pony toward her mother, and Winona had carried both girls, one on each hip, 11 miles through broken country that would have killed a lesser woman twice over before she stopped moving. She did not stop again, not really, not for 2 years. She had simply traded one kind of running for another, quieter kind, until she found a hollow that no map would ever mark and no cavalry patrol would ever think to search. She had not gone to another band, not at first, because bands were exactly what patrols went looking for, and she would not risk her daughters on anyone's protection but her own until she understood the shape of the danger around her. She had not gone into Coyote Wells for help, because towns like Coyote Wells did not help Apache widows. They ran them off, or worse, and she had heard enough from her mother's generation to know precisely what worse could mean. So she did the only thing left to a woman with 2 children, no rifle, no horse, and no kin. Close enough to reach in time. She hid, and she hunted what little she could with snares and a skinning knife worn thin from years of use. And when the game thinned with the season, she let her daughters go down into town before dawn to take what the town would never miss. Pride, she had decided somewhere in that first terrible winter, was a luxury for people who weren't watching their children's ribs show through their skin. It cost her something every single morning to send them. She never spoke it aloud to Jesse, not for a long while, but he came to understand it In the set of her jaw those first mornings he still watched from the fence, the way she'd stand just inside the tree line above town, unseen until both girls were safely back up the trail. She was not a woman who did anything easily. She had run out of other choices, and she hated the shape of the one she'd landed on with a fury she kept banked as low as her cook fire smoke, because a fury like that, let loose, would only get her daughters killed faster than the hunger would. There had been a spring the year before when she had nearly broken her own rule and walked into Coyote Wells herself in daylight, in the desperate weeks after the last of the winter's dried meat ran out and before the first greens came up enough to matter. She had stood at the edge of the tree line above the road for the better part of an hour, watching wagons go by, weighing the risk of being seen against the certainty of 2 more days of empty bellies, and in the end she had turned back up the mountain without ever stepping onto that road, because she had decided, coldly and finally, that a starving mother was still a mother, but a dead one was no use to anyone. She told herself that decision had been wisdom. Some nights, lying awake with her daughter's ribs sharp against her arms, it had felt like nothing more than cowardice, wearing wisdom's coat, and she carried both feelings at once for a long time, the way a person carries any decision made with no good option in it at all. Jesse came back to the wash 4 days later, not sneaking this time, walking in plain along the same trail so she'd hear him coming and have no cause to think he meant to catch her unaware. He carried a sack over one shoulder. Flour, a side of bacon, a twist of coffee, things a rancher's larder could spare without anyone missing them, and he set it down at the 20-step mark he'd learned was hers to draw, not his. Brought you some provisions. No strings on it. Winona looked at the sack the way another woman might look at a snake, sunning itself on her doorstep. I did not ask for your charity, Mr. Cade. Didn't say you did. Said I brought it. There is a difference between giving and being permitted to give. She hadn't moved toward the sack. Behind her, the twins. He'd learn their names soon. Apache and Doli, quick, dark eyes that missed nothing, peered out from behind the brush screen with the particular hunger of children who have learned not to hope out loud. You believe because you are a rancher with more cattle than sense that you may simply decide to feed us, and I will be grateful and small about it. I am not small, Mr. Cade. I have kept these girls alive through a winter that should have finished us both. I will not begin owing my life to a white man's sack of flour. Now, wasn't asking you to owe me anything? Every gift is owed, sooner or later. No heat in her voice, only the flat certainty of a woman reciting a lesson learned the hard way, more than once. That is how your people have always done business with mine. Take it back down the mountain. He didn't take it back. He set it at the 20-step line. It'll be here if you want it, and it'll rot if you don't. And either way, I'm not carrying flour back down a mountain I already carried it up, and turned and left before she could argue further. When he came back 3 days later, the sack was gone from where he'd left it, and there was no thank you waiting for him, but there was no argument either, and Jesse decided that was a kind of progress a man could work with. It went like that for the better part of a month, Jesse climbing up every few days with what he could spare, without Purdy noticing the ranch stores dwindling faster than 400 head of cattle could account for. Winona meeting him with less ice in her voice each time, even as she never once thanked him outright. The twins growing bold enough to creep closer than 20 steps to see what he'd brought. Apache, the elder by some 11 minutes as he eventually learned, was the braver of the two. Quick to plant herself in front of Jesse and study him with a frankness that made him want to laugh, and also made him feel thoroughly seen through. Doli, the younger, hung back longer, watching from behind her sister's shoulder, and it was Doli's cough, the one that had first snagged Jesse's attention from the fence rail, that worried Winona most as the nights turned properly cold. She needs a doctor. Quiet, watching the girl's shoulder shake with the cough across the fire. There is no doctor in Coyote Wells who will treat an Apache child. Flat, without bitterness, the way you'd note that water runs downhill. Doc Whitfield turned away a mescalero man 2 winters back with a bullet in his leg and left it to God whether he lived. I will not carry my daughter down that mountain for the same. There's a doctor 2 days east in Silver City who might, 2 days each direction, in this cold, with a sick child. No final, the way most things touching her daughter's safety came out of her. The door closed and the latch thrown. But Jesse noticed she didn't send him away that night, and when he came back 2 evenings later, he brought a jar of honey and a tin of the mustard plaster his own mother had sworn by for chest colds. Winona took both, without a word of thanks and without telling him to carry them back down the mountain either, and something in the exchange felt, for the first time, less like charity being tolerated, and more like 2 people building something between them out of small, stubborn pieces. Coyote Wells was not a large town, which meant a rancher's absence from his own spread 3 and 4 times a week did not go unremarked for long. The first to remark on it loudly, and to anyone who'd listen, was a man named Otis Granger, who ran the mercantile and considered himself the moral compass of a town that had never once wanted him to be. Cade's been seen going up into the hills, loud to the men at the saloon bar, the same bar whose back alley had fed 2 starving girls for the better part of a year, without a single one of these men noticing or caring. Up where that Apache woman's supposed to be holed up, my boy saw him with a sack over his shoulder, if you can credit that, feeding her like she's some stray cat. Ain't none of our business what Cade does with his own flour, the bartender put in. A man called Sully who'd known Jesse's father and had a longer memory for decency than most in that room. It's our business when he's letting Apaches squat in the hills above a Christian town. Granger found enough heads nodding along that he kept going. That woman's people killed the Barlow family not 2 years back, over toward the Gila. You want her raising her whelps close enough to walk in and slit our throats some night? It wasn't true, the Barlow killings. Everyone in the room half knew, if they'd thought about it honestly, had been laid at the feet of a band that had nothing to do with Winona's people, and had themselves been provoked by cattle stolen, first by white ranchers pushing onto land no treaty had ever ceded. But truth traveled slower than fear in a town like Coyote Wells, and by the time the story had made its way around the saloon twice more, it had grown teeth it never had at the start. Granger began talking, not quietly, about riding up to deal with the situation, and though most of the men in that bar had no more stomach for riding against a starving woman and 2 children than they had for honest work, talk like that had a way of finding the 1 or 2 men who did. Granger's grievance with Jesse ran deeper than Apache blood, if anyone had cared to look at it plainly. He had courted Jesse's late mother's niece 3 summers back and lost her to a Silver City freighter within the month, had watched the Cade spread grow while his own mercantile scraped along on credit and complaint, and had never once forgiven a man he considered beneath him for having more than he did. Winona gave him a cause. She did not give him the reason underneath it, but reasons rarely matter to a man already looking for somewhere to point his temper. Word of the talk reached Jesse through Purdy, who'd caught it from Sully, who rode out special to warn him before it could reach him second-hand, and twisted worse. You need to get her off that mountain. Purdy sat his horse in the yard with the particular grimness of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to. Granger's been drinking and talking big for a week now. Might be nothing, might not be. But a woman, alone up there, with 2 children, and men who've had a week to work themselves up over nothing. I wouldn't wait to find out which it is. Jesse didn't wait. He rode up that same afternoon, faster than he'd ever taken that trail, and found Winona kneeling over the fire, with Doli's breathing gone thin and wheezing in a way that frightened him more than Granger's whiskey courage had. He laid it all out for her. Granger, the Barlow lie, the talk of riding up, and watched her face go through something complicated. Fear and fury and a weariness so old it seemed to come from further back than her own life. This is what I warned you of. Quiet, but it landed harder than a shout would have. This is what your kindness costs. Now they know exactly where to find us, because a rancher could not stop climbing this mountain. Then, don't stay on the mountain. The words were out of him before he'd fully thought them through, but once said he found he meant every one of them. Come down to the ranch. I've got a line shack a half-mile from the main house. Sound roof, a stove that draws. Nobody rides out that way without me knowing first. And when your Mr. Granger comes asking why there's an Apache woman living on Cade land. Then he asks me, and I tell him it's my land and my business, same as it's always been. Jessie met her eyes across the fire. Steady. I'm not asking you to trust the town, Winona. I'm asking you to trust that I'll stand at my own door and not move. She looked at him a long moment, measuring, the way she measured everything. A woman who had learned that a wrong guess about a man's character could cost her daughters their lives. Then she looked at Doli, whose small chest was working too hard for the cold night air, and something in her decided for my daughters. Flat, final. Not for you, do not mistake it, wouldn't dream of it. He went to help her gather the one blanket, the one pot, and the whole of what she owned in this world. The line shack was small, but it was warm, and for the first time in 2 years Winona slept a full night without waking every hour to listen for footsteps that weren't her daughters. Jessie kept his word. He laid the truth out plain for Purdy and swore him to quiet, which cost nothing since Purdy had never had much use for Granger's opinions anyway, and he made sure the twins had proper boots before the first hard freeze, and taught a pony who took to it faster than most ranch hands he'd trained. How to sit a gentle mare. He kept for exactly this purpose. Doli's cough eased with warmth and rest and the honey Jessie kept bringing, though it took the better part of 3 weeks before Winona stopped waking at every small sound the girl made in the night. Jessie noticed things about Winona in those weeks he hadn't let himself notice up in the cold wash. The particular grace in how she moved, even half-starved, the dry humor that surfaced once she'd decided a person had earned the right to hear it. The fierce and unashamed love she carried for her daughters that colored everything she did. Right down to the careful way she rationed her own gratitude, like she still expected somewhere down the line to have to pay it back at interest. She was, he came to see, a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She cataloged the weather the way he cataloged cattle, could read a coming storm 2 days out from the way the light sat on the mountains, knew by the behavior of the ranch dogs which riders approaching the gate were friendly before Jessie himself had made out a face. She kept the twins' moccasins mended with a patience that would have driven a lesser woman to distraction, and she taught them, in the low hours before sleep, songs in a language Jessie did not understand and never once asked her to translate. Because he'd come to understand that some things a person keeps are not diminished, and he did not want to be the reason anything of hers got smaller. The ranch hands, 3 men Jessie kept on, through the winter besides Purdy, took their cue from their employer, and gave the newcomers a wide, easy berth, curious, a few of them, in the way men are curious about anything new on a quiet ranch, but none of them fool enough to voice it where Jessie could hear, and none of them cruel enough to voice it where the girls could. Purdy, for his part, went from wary to thoroughly won over, inside of a month, chiefly on the strength of a pony's questions about horses which came faster and sharper than any he'd fielded from a grown hand in a decade, and he took to calling her his shadow with a gruff affection that made Winona's guarded eyes soften every time she caught it. Winona herself did not sit idle in that shack, waiting on Jessie's charity to run its course. Within the first 2 weeks she had taken stock of every seam that needed mending on the place, had found the kitchen garden Jessie's mother had let go to weeds years back, and begun turning the soil for spring before anyone thought to ask her to, and had started trading her skill with a needle and her knowledge of the country's plants for small things around the ranch, a length of good wool cloth, a sturdier pair of boots for a pony, extra lamp oil for the long winter evenings, in a running ledger of her own devising that she kept scrupulously balanced in her head, because owing nothing to anyone remained, even here, even now, the single rule she would not bend. Jesse noticed the garden first, coming out one morning to find neat turned rows where there had been nothing but bramble the week before, and he understood, without being told, that this was Winona's way of saying she intended to stay a while, in the only language of gratitude pride would allow her to speak. You don't trust easy. One evening, the two of them sitting on the shack's narrow porch while the girls slept inside, the whole valley gone quiet and blue dark below them, I trusted easily. Once I trusted that soldiers would see we carried no weapons before they fired. I trusted a treaty line drawn by men who had never walked a land they were dividing. No self-pity in it, only the flat accounting of a woman who kept careful ledgers. Trust is not a thing I can afford the way I once could, Mr. Cade. Jessie, then. The corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that he counted it a victory. You are patient, I will say that for you. Most men I have known want a debt repaid the moment they've handed it over. You have fed us a month and asked nothing back. Wasn't looking for anything back. Everyone is looking for something, even the good ones. She studied the fire in the little stove through the open door, her profile sharp and lovely in the low light, and Jesse found himself thinking, not for the first time, that gaunt as the winter had left her. She was the most striking woman he'd ever sat beside in his life. What is it you are looking for, Jesse Cade? He thought about lying or deflecting, the way a more careful man might have. He didn't. Company, maybe. I've run this ranch alone since my folks passed, and Purdy's good company. But he's 61 years old, and mostly talks about horses he used to own. I look at you and your girls in that shack, and it's the first time in longer than I care to admit that this place has felt like it had people in it instead of just work. Winona didn't answer right away. Something shifted behind her eyes that he couldn't quite name, and then she looked away back toward the fire and offered only that it was late, which wasn't a no, and Jesse decided to take it for exactly what it was. Not a door closed, but a door left ajar for another night. More of her came out in pieces, over the weeks that followed, always sideways. Never laid down whole and at once. Her mother teaching her to find water in country that looked bone dry to anyone who hadn't grown up reading it, the song sung over a new baby. A girlhood spent following her grandmother through mountains that had names in her language older than Coyote Wells itself would ever be. It wasn't a performance meant to make herself understood. Jesse came to see that Winona had little patience for being explained to strangers like a curiosity in a traveling show. It came out simply because a person cannot live 12 hours a day beside another person and keep the whole of themselves locked away forever, no matter how hard won the caution. The second crisis came from ground. Jesse hadn't thought to guard. In the first hard week of December, a fever swept through Coyote Wells the way fevers do in small towns with one crowded schoolhouse and no real notion of quarantine, and it did not stay politely on the town side of the Cade property line. A pony went down with it first, burning hot by supper time and shivering by midnight, despite every blanket in the shack piled over her, and by the second day Doli had caught it too, her cough. The one Jesse had thought long conquered, returning worse than it had ever been. Wet and rattling in a way that put a fear in Winona's face Jesse had not seen there. Even the night Granger's riders came up the road. This is not the cough from before. Low over Dolly's bed, in the gray hour before dawn, her hands moving with the competence Jesse had watched all winter, but never quite seen this stripped bare and desperate. This is deeper. I have seen it before in the camps when it moves through children fast. We do not have time to argue about doctors who will not see her. Then we don't ask Whitfield. Jesse was already reaching for his coat. There's a woman 2 hours north, past the Hollis place, a granny doctor. The ranch families use when they don't trust what's in town. She won't ask whose children they are. He rode through country he knew like his own hands, but had never before ridden that hard in the dark, and came back with a stout, unhurried woman named Mrs. Calloway, who took one look at Doli, listened to her chest with an ear pressed flat against the girl's back, and set to work without a single question about the color of the children's skin or the shape of their mother's grief. It was 3 days before the fever broke in both girls, 3 days in which Winona did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch, and Jessie did not leave the shack except to see to the horses. 3 days in which the two of them worked side by side over basins of cool water and cups of Mrs. Dadiest Calloway's bitter tea, without either one of them finding the time or the breath to say anything about what was growing between them, because there was no room left in either of them for anything but the girls. It was Jessie, on the second night, who found Winona outside the shack door in the freezing dark, her composure finally, briefly given way, her shoulders shaking with a silence more terrible than any sound. He did not say anything foolish about it being all right, because he did not know that it was, and he did not reach for her the way a man reaches for a woman he is courting. He simply stood beside her in the cold and let her know, without a word, that she did not have to carry the watching alone that night, and after a while her shoulders stopped shaking, and she went back inside to sit with her daughters. Neither of them ever spoke of that particular hour again, though both of them carried it long after. By the fourth morning both girls were sitting up asking for broth, cranky and weak, but unmistakably on the mend, and Mrs. Calloway packed her bag with the satisfied air of a woman who had done this 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. She refused Jessie's offer of payment beyond what the visit was plainly worth, and on her way out, the door left him with a piece of advice unasked for, that he'd best marry that woman before some other rancher, with sense enough to see what he was looking at, came along and did it first. Jessie had no ready answer for that, but he turned it over the whole ride back from seeing her off, and a good deal more in the weeks that followed. Granger did not let the matter rest, because men like Granger rarely do. Through the early weeks of winter he kept the talk alive in the saloon. And when talk alone didn't move Jessie to send the Apache woman off his land, he tried other avenues. A word to the man who held the note on Jessie's feed contracts, a suggestion to the county land office that Cade's boundary markers hadn't been properly filed in years. Small mean pressures meant to make life difficult, enough that Jessie would decide the trouble wasn't worth it. None of it moved him. If anything, it settled something in Jessie that had been loose before, a plain, stubborn refusal to be pushed off his own porch by a man whose real grievance had nothing to do with Apache blood and everything to do with an old wounded pride. It came to a head on a bitter evening in late November when 4 riders came up the Cade road well after dark, Granger among them, along with 3 men whose courage owed more to a bottle passed between saddles than to any conviction of their own. Jessie heard them before he saw them, the particular unhurried arrogance of men who believed the night belonged to them, and he was out on the porch with a lantern and his father's shotgun cracked open over one arm before they'd cleared the last rise. Evening, Granger. Bit late for a social call? We come for the Apache woman, Cade. Town's decided she ain't welcome this close, and we mean to see her escorted off. Granger's voice had the false steadiness of a man who'd rehearsed his lines on the ride over. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard, but either way, she's not stopping the winter on Cade land. She's not on Cade land as your business, Otis. She's on Cade land as my guest, and my guests don't get escorted anywhere they don't choose to go. Jessie hadn't raised the shotgun, hadn't needed to yet, but he'd made sure they could all see it. You've got a grievance. It's with me, not a woman and 2 children, half your own daughter's age. So say your piece to me. What none of the 4 men on that road knew, what Jessie himself only half suspected until the shack door opened behind him, was that Winona had heard every word from inside, and had not stayed inside to let a man fight a battle that was by her own accounting entirely hers. She stepped out onto the porch beside Jessie with her chin level and her eyes steady on Granger, and though she carried no weapon, there was something in the stillness of her that made even drunk men go quiet. You rode up a mountain at night to frighten a widow and her children. Her voice carried further than Jessie would have thought possible for someone her size. I buried my husband because soldiers mistook a hunting camp for a war party. I have watched my daughters go hungry because a town would rather feed its scraps to hogs than to children whose only crime is the color of their skin. I am not afraid of 4 men who needed whiskey to find their courage before riding up here. Go home, Mr. Granger. There is nothing for you on this mountain but a rancher with a shotgun and a woman who has already survived worse than you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jesse could hear the horses shifting, the wind working through the pines behind the shack, his own heartbeat loud in his ears. One of Granger's 3 companions, a younger man named Petty, who worked the livery stable and had less stomach for this than his friends, allowed under his breath that this wasn't what he'd signed on for, no threatening children, and turned his horse, without waiting for agreement, the thread that unraveled the whole ugly errand. A second rider followed a moment later, something about the cold. Granger, left with only the drunkest of his companions and no more courage of his own than theirs, spat into the dirt, called it a warning, and rode off into the dark with considerably less dignity than he'd arrived with. Jesse let his breath out slow once the hoofbeats had faded, and looked over to find Winona watching him. Not Granger's retreating back. Something shifted in her face that hadn't been there an hour before. You didn't have to come out here. I had it. I know you did. I came out because it was mine to answer, not only yours to carry. She held his gaze steady. You stood at your door. Jesse Cade, exactly as you promised. I have watched men give their word for a great deal more and deliver a great deal less. Does that mean I've earned some trust? It means you have earned the right to ask me that question and receive an honest answer instead of silence. The almost smile from the porch a few weeks back became something closer to the real thing, brief and startling and lovely. Ask me again in the spring, Jesse Cade, and see what I say then. Winter closed in hard after that, the kind of New Mexico territory cold that turned the line shack's little stove into the most important object on the ranch. And in the long weeks of snow and short daylight, something between Jesse and Winona settled into a rhythm neither of them named out loud, but both of them understood. He brought wood before she had to ask. She took up mending his shirts in return, unprompted, quick, clever stitches that outlasted anything the dry goods store in town could sell him, and refused, still, to call it anything but fair trade for the roof over her daughters' heads, even though both of them knew by then it had stopped being about debts a long while back. A pony took to ranch life the way some children take to water. Following Purdy around the corrals asking questions, he was delighted to answer at length, growing steady and quick with the gentle mare, until even Jesse admitted the girl had a natural hand with horses better than most grown men he'd hired. Doli stayed quieter, more watchful, but her cough was long gone by the first thaw, and she'd taken to sitting by Jesse in the evenings while he mended tack, handing him tools with a seriousness that made him want to laugh and touch something in his chest besides. It was Doli, in fact, who put into words the thing neither Jesse nor Winona had yet spoken between themselves, on an evening in early March, with the first green just starting to push up through the mud around the corrals. Are you going to marry my mother? The flat directness only a child that age can manage, put to him while she pretended to help him clean a bridle. Jesse nearly dropped the leather in his hands. Across the small room, Winona went very still over the mending in her lap, not looking up, though the color that rose in her gaunt no longer face said she'd heard every word. That's between your mother and me, I expect. Careful. Once he'd found his voice again. A pony says you look at her like Papa used to. Simply without guile, the way children hand you the truth before they've learned to be careful with it. I think you should. She doesn't sleep bad anymore. Since we came here, she used to sleep bad all the time. Winona set her mending aside with great and deliberate calm, though her hands, Jesse noticed, were not quite steady, and sent Doli off to help her sister with the mare. The girl went unbothered, the way children go when they've put an important thing into the air, and trust the adults to sort out the rest of it, and the small room was very quiet once the door had shut behind her. Jesse set the bridle down too, and for a long moment neither of them offered anything at all. "She's not wrong. Finally, about how I look at you, I know." Her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it, all its usual iron-banked low. "I have known for some time. I kept quiet because I did not trust myself to speak it, and mean only what I intended. And what did you intend to me?" She looked up at him, then, and there was none of the wariness left in her eyes that had greeted him across a hidden campfire 5 months before. Only something steadier, harder won, and entirely certain. "That I buried one husband already, Jessie Cade, and swore I would never again build my daughter's safety on a man's promise, because promises did not stop army bullets, and they did not fill empty bellies through a long winter. I built it myself instead alone, because I believed that was the only way it would hold." Her chin lifted, proud even now, even here. "But you have brought wood before I asked for it every week since November. You stood at your door with a shotgun for a woman who owed you nothing. You taught my daughter to ride, and never once made her feel less than any child born on this land. I did not think I would trust a man again in this life. I was wrong. Winona, I am not finished." A ghost of that dry humor again, even now, even with her voice not quite steady. "I loved my husband, and I will not pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. But I have watched you all winter, Jessie Cade, and I find that I love you too, in a different shape than I thought love would ever take again. If you are asking whether I would marry you, the answer is yes. If you are not asking, then I have said a great deal more than I intended, and you may forget most of it." He crossed the small room in 3 steps and did not let her forget any of it. They married in April, in front of the line shack that had become, by unspoken agreement, simply home rather than a temporary shelter. Winona had wanted one thing beyond the ceremony the county recorder would insist on, that a few of her mother's people, camped that season within 2 days' ride, be sent for to stand witness in the way her own people would have recognized as a true marriage, and Jessie had ridden out himself to carry the invitation. Understanding, without being told, that a wedding, recorded only in a white minister's book, would have left something unfinished in her. They came, 6 of them, an aunt of Winona's mother, chief among them a sharp-eyed woman named Julian, who studied Jessie for the better part of an hour before pronouncing him, in halting English, offered only once, and never repeated, tolerable, which Winona later admitted, laughing properly for the first time since he'd known her, was about as fine a blessing as the old woman had ever given any man. He stood witness on the other side of the ledger with more pride than he'd admit to, having spent the morning fussing over his one good shirt like a man 20 years younger. Apony and Doli wore new dresses. Winona had sewn herself from cloth. Jessie had ridden 2 days to Silver City to buy without telling anyone why, and Apony spent most of the ceremony itself, more interested in the borrowed mare tied nearby than in the vows which struck everyone present as exactly right for her. A handful of townsfolk came too, Sully among them, and a few others who'd grown quietly ashamed of Granger's winter campaign once they'd actually laid eyes on the woman and children he'd wanted run off a mountain in the snow. Granger himself did not attend, and left Coyote Wells for good. Less than a year later, his mercantile bought out by a man with considerably less taste for stirring up trouble that wasn't his to stir. The ceremony itself was a strange and lovely stitching together of 2 worlds that had spent most of that year trying to keep Winona and her daughters apart. The minister said his lines, and the county recorder made his mark, and afterward, away from the recorder's book, Guyen sang something low and old over the couple's joined hands, while the last of the April light came down gold through the pines, and Jessie, who understood not one word of the song, and who found that he did not need to understand it, to feel the full weight of what it meant. Winona wore for the occasion a dress she had spent 3 months quietly working on in whatever hours the ranch and her daughters left free, soft dewskin, traded fair and square from a passing trader, worked with beadwork in patterns her mother had taught her, patterns that told to anyone who knew how to read them. Nan, T, a story of survival and homecoming that no English words in that ceremony would ever quite capture. She had debated, in the weeks leading up to it, whether such a dress belonged at a wedding meant to satisfy a county recorder's book, and had decided in the end that it belonged precisely because of that. Because she intended to walk into this marriage exactly as herself, gaunt winter behind her, and let Jesse Cade marry the whole of the woman standing in front of him rather than any smaller, safer version of her. Winona did not become only what a rancher's wife was expected to be, and Jesse never once wanted her to. She kept her mother's language alive in the house, taught her daughters the songs and the stories that were theirs by right of blood, and when a small band of her mother's people passed within a day's ride 2 summers later, she rode out with a pony and Doli to sit with them a week, and Jesse minded the ranch and left well enough alone. Because he had learned, in the way that mattered, that loving Winona meant loving all of her, not the parts that made a rancher's life simpler, but the whole fierce and proud and tender truth of who she was. She went on adding to the ranch's ledgers of knowledge in her own quiet way, besides teaching Purdy and the hands things about the land, where water ran even in drought, which plants eased a fever, how to read weather 3 days out, that no rancher's almanac had ever thought to record, until half of what the Cade spread came to know about surviving that country. It survived because of her. More children came in the years after, a son born the following winter whom they named for both grandfathers in a ceremony that again drew Guyon and her people down from the mountains, and a second daughter 3 years after that, round-cheeked and never once hungry a day in her life, which Winona called, only half joking, the whole reward she'd wanted from the world, and more than she'd expected to get. The ranch prospered, as ranches do when the people running them have finally stopped fighting each other and started fighting only the weather and the market, and by the time a pony and Doli were grown, Coyote Wells had quietly become a town that no longer told the old story about an Apache woman run off a mountain, but told instead, proudly, the story of the Cade Ranch and the woman who'd built half of it alongside her husband. Doli grew strong, her lungs never troubling her again past that first hard winter, and went on, in time, to be the closest thing Coyote Wells had to its own granny doctor, having learned from Mrs. Tad. Calloway, everything the old woman knew, and adding to it besides. A pony grew into the finest horsewoman Coyote Wells had ever seen, man or woman, and broke more of the Cade herd's green stock than Purdy or Jesse combined by the time she was 16, going on to run her own small spread of paints and cow ponies that ranchers rode 2 counties over to buy from. Purdy lived to see both girls grown and settled in their own right, and swore to anyone who'd listen right up through his last winter that teaching a pony Cade to sit a horse had been the finest piece of work of his whole life on that ranch, prouder of it than of anything he'd managed with his own 2 hands. And Winona gaunt no longer, the hollows of that terrible first winter, long since filled back in, her braid gone silver at the temple only decades later. Surrounded always by grandchildren who knew exactly who they were and where they came from, used to tell the story when she told it at all. Jesse Cade, she would begin, had followed 2 hungry children into the hills because he could not make himself look away from something wrong, and that not the sack of flour, not the shotgun on the porch, not even the wood brought unasked through a long cold winter. Not kindness offered from a safe distance, but a man willing to climb the whole mountain to find out what he was choosing before he chose it. And every time the story came around again, she would look at Jesse across whatever room they happened to be sitting in, and something would pass between them that 50 years of marriage had never once worn thin, and the last line never changed, that a woman does not need saving. She only needs, once in a great while, someone willing to walk far enough to see her exactly as she is, and to decide, having seen her, that she was worth every step of the climb.